Introduction. Setting the scene. Everwood was the kind of place that time seemed to forget. Nestled deep in the heart of a dense forest, the small town felt suspended in another era, with its cobblestone streets, old-fashioned houses, and a constant quiet whisper of wind that never seemed to die down. It was a town that never changed, or at least that was how Lily remembered it. She had left Everwood 15 years ago, a teenager with dreams of escaping the shadow of her reclusive father. But now, at 30, she was back, alone, grieving the sudden death of the man who had always kept his distance. Her father had never been a warm presence in her life. He was an enigma, a silent figure who barely spoke, let alone offered the comfort a daughter might crave. She hadn't even known he was ill, and when the call came, she felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. He was gone, and she was the one left with the consequences of his absence. As Lily drove through the winding forest roads toward her father's house, the world around her seemed to close in. The towering trees pressed against the road like silent sentinels, and the air was thick with the smell of pine. The house, once familiar, loomed in front of her, a decaying relic of a life she had left behind. The porch creaked beneath her boots as she stepped out of her car, the scent of mildew and dust greeting her as she pushed open the front door. It wasn't as she remembered. The walls, once a warm shade of cream, were now stained with age, and the floorboards groaned under her weight as if they hadn't supported anyone in years. The silence was oppressive, and as she wandered through the rooms, it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to uncover something. But what unsettled Lily most was the way the townspeople reacted when she passed by. They didn't greet her as they used to. Instead, their eyes seemed to dart away, their whispers rising and falling just out of reach. The air was thick with a tension she couldn't place. It was as if the town had changed in the years she'd been gone, and whatever secrets it held, they weren't meant for her to understand. Lily explores her father's house. The first night in the house was restless. Lily tried to settle in, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, filling the corners of the rooms with a sense of foreboding. She couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. The house was cold. Too cold for a place that should have felt like home. By morning, the unease had only deepened. After a sparse breakfast of stale bread and coffee, she decided to start sorting through her father's things, hoping to find some answers. She found the old attic door hidden beneath a pile of forgotten furniture. It was locked, but after some effort, she pried it open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. The attic was suffocating. Dust choked the air, and the narrow beams above her head seemed to close in as she carefully picked her way through the clutter. Piles of yellowed papers, old furniture, and boxes filled with forgotten odds and ends littered the floor. But something in the far corner caught her eye. A small wooden chest, barely visible beneath an old rug. With trembling hands, she opened the chest, revealing an assortment of items that seemed to belong to another time. Photographs, trinkets, and an old leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the writing was still legible, its dark ink a stark contrast against the faded paper. As she flipped through the pages, her heart began to race. Her father's handwriting was uneven, frantic, as though he had been trying to make sense of something. The entries spoke of whispers in the shadows, things that should not be seen, and most chillingly, the pact. The symbols that surrounded the text were strange, unfamiliar, like something out of a nightmare. There was a line that particularly caught her attention. The door in the basement will open the way, but it is not for the faint of heart. The words seemed to swim in front of her eyes, the room growing colder with every sentence she read. A chill ran down her spine. The house felt like it was shifting around her, groaning and creaking, as if the very walls were alive. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo in the silence, and she swore she could hear faint whispers rising from the depths of the house. Suddenly, the light flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Lily's pulse quickened, and she looked around, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing in on her. The house felt wrong. In the final entry, her father's handwriting seemed to falter, the ink smudging at the edge of the page. I've hidden the key, but the door must remain shut, but practice not mine to break. Her hands shook as she turned the page, but there was nothing more. The journal ended abruptly, and the silence in the attic seemed to deepen. The hidden door in the basement, the pact, her father's cryptic words. What had he been involved in? Lily had a sinking feeling that whatever secrets her father had kept, they were darker than she could have ever imagined. Meeting the townspeople. The next morning, Lily decided to visit the local store. Her father had always kept to himself, but she wondered if any of the townspeople could shed light on his life here. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The store was small, filled with the scent of old wood and the faint tang of dried herbs. Behind the counter stood John, a familiar face from her childhood. John had always been the quiet type, a year older than her, and they'd shared a few innocent childhood conversations before she left for the city. Now, however, there was an awkwardness between them, as if years of silence had created a wall that neither knew how to tear down. "Hey, John," Lily said, offering a hesitant smile. His eyes widened slightly, his lips tightening. "Lily, didn't expect to see you back." "Yeah," she said, trying to sound casual. "My father passed away." He nodded, but his gaze quickly shifted away, focusing on the shelves behind her, as if he was desperately searching for something to distract him. The tension in the air was thick, and Lily felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against her. "Is there anything I should know about him?" she asked, her voice quiet. "About the town, or, well, anything." John gave a stiff smile. "Your father was a quiet man, didn't bother anyone, but maybe you should talk to the sheriff about that." Before Lily could ask him more, he quickly turned and started organizing a stack of canned goods, clearly eager to end the conversation. She left, her curiosity still gnawing at her. Outside, she walked slowly down the street, pondering John's strange behavior. It didn't make sense. He was avoiding the topic, but why? She continued her walk through the town, eventually reaching Mrs. Green's house. Mrs. Green was the town's oldest resident, known for her cryptic manner of speaking and her strange, unsettling way of seeing things. She had once been a friend of Lily's mother, but Lily had never quite understood her. Mrs. Green sat on her porch, rocking slowly in her chair, her eyes fixed on something far
in the distance. Her gaze flickered toward Lily, and a shiver ran down the younger woman's spine. "Well, if it isn't Lily," Mrs. Green said, her voice raspy but knowing. "You've come back, haven't you? Just like the others did. Just like your father." Lily felt a chill at the mention of her father, but she forced herself to smile. I'm just here to figure things out. There's a lot I don't understand." Mrs. Green's eyes narrowed, her lips twisting into a cryptic smile. "You won't understand it, old child. Not until it's too late. The shadows know you're here, and they don't forget. They'll come for you, just like they came for him." Lily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" But before Mrs. Green could answer, a low, hushed voice from the shadows interrupted. "Leave her be, Doris." The sheriff, Mark, stepped into view, his expression stern and unyielding. Mark was a solid, imposing figure who had been the sheriff of Everwood for as long as Lily could remember. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp, but there was something in his gaze, something protective, something hidden, that unsettled her. "Mark," Lily greeted, though she felt his presence was like a wall between her and Mrs. Green. "She means no harm," Mark said, his tone softer, though it still carried a weight of authority. "But there are things better left unspoken, Lily. You'd do well to heed the warning." Lily stared at him, unsure of whether he was protecting her or hiding something. She opened her mouth to protest, but Mark gave a brief nod, as though signaling the end of the conversation. "You should go," he added, his voice low, almost a command. "It's not safe for you to be digging around in things you don't understand." Mrs. Green's eyes flickered to Mark, and she smiled faintly, as if she knew something he didn't. Lily walked away, her mind swirling with questions. There was something wrong in this town, something dark that neither John nor Mark was willing to confront. And it seemed her father's death had something to do with it. Unearthing the town's dark history. Determined to uncover the truth, Lily spent the following days delving into the history of Everwood. She visited the local library, searching through old newspapers and town records. Her father's name appeared in some of the older articles, usually in relation to missing persons, strange occurrences, and rituals that seemed to have been performed under the cover of darkness. The more Lily read, the more she began to piece together the chilling history of the town. There had been a series of unexplained disappearances over the years, often people who had ventured too deep into the forest.
Surrounding Everwood. The stories all spoke of a pact that the townspeople had made long ago, a deal struck with an ancient force that lived in the shadows of the forest. And her father, her distant, enigmatic father, had once been part of this secret group. A group that practiced dark rituals, using the forest's power to protect the town from an evil that none of them could truly understand. Lily's heart raced as she connected the dots. Her father had been involved in these rituals. He had made the same pact that the townsfolk had kept hidden for generations. She had to confront the truth. Her father's death had not been natural. It wasn't just a sickness that had taken him. There were whispers of betrayal, of dark forces at work. And as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the unease Lily had felt began to take on a more sinister shape. The town's strange behaviour, the cryptic warnings, the shadows in the corners of her vision, all of it pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The pact was still active, and the town was still protecting itself from something ancient. That night, as Lily made her way back to her father's house, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. A shiver ran down her spine as she heard footsteps behind her, following her through the dark, narrow streets. She quickened her pace, heart pounding, but the footsteps grew louder. The forest loomed ahead, its dark shapes casting twisted shadows in the moonlight. Lily turned quickly, but whatever or whoever was following her was closing in. Fear gripped her chest as she bolted toward the house, barely managing to slam the door shut behind her. The shadows had been following her, and now they were closer than ever. The hidden door and the pat Lily had barely slept. Her mind buzzed with the images of the symbols, her father's journal, and the warnings she had received from the townspeople. She could no longer ignore the pull of the basement, the secret her father had hidden away in the dark depths of his house. He had written about it in the journal, and now Lily had no choice but to face the truth. The basement door stood ominously at the foot of the stairs, almost mocking her hesitation. With her heart pounding, she approached it. The old wood creaked as she pushed it open, revealing the narrow spiralling staircase that led into the belly of the house. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and something else. Something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. Lily took a deep breath and descended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The darkness seemed to press in around her, but she refused to turn back. She had to know what her father had been hiding. At the bottom, the basement stretched before her like a forgotten world. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty jars, old tools, and objects that seemed oddly out of place. Bones, strange stones, and intricately carved idols. But the most striking thing was the large wooden door at the far end of the room. It was different from all the others in the house, heavier, older, and covered in strange symbols, much like those she had seen in her father's journal. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. It opened with a low, eerie groan, revealing a small chamber beyond. The room was lit only by a single candle, flickering weakly on a stone altar at its center. The walls were lined with more symbols, painted in dark red ink that looked disturbingly fresh despite the age of the room. As Lily stepped forward, her foot brushed against something cold, an ancient scroll, partially unrolled on the floor. She picked it up, her heart racing as she unfurled it. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. She read aloud under her breath, her voice quivering in the silence. The pact must be kept, for the shadows will rise. Every generation must pay the price. One life for the town's safety, one life to contain the darkness. The words felt like a weight pressing on her chest. The pact. It was real. The evil her father had spent his life protecting them from was bound by this dark bargain. Each generation, one life was taken, sacrificed to hold back the shadows. The altar before her was the site of countless rituals to ensure the pact was fulfilled. Her father had been part of this, a willing participant in the horrors that had plagued Everwood for generations. But something had gone wrong. Lily's throat tightened as she realized the truth. Her father had died because he had broken the pact. He had planned to expose it, to free the town from its dark history. But the shadows had caught him before he could act. They had taken him, just as they had taken so many others. Lily's eyes darted around the room. The shadows in the corners of the chamber seemed to shift, as if alive. The temperature dropped, and she could feel an unnatural presence surrounding her, suffocating her. Suddenly, the shadows in the room began to stir, growing darker, more solid. Shapes began to form, twisting and writhing, their dark limbs reaching toward her. The air grew cold, and Lily could hear whispers, low, guttural sounds in a language she didn't understand. Her heart raced, and a primal fear surged through her veins. They were coming for her. She backed away from the altar, that the shadows followed, creeping along the walls and floor. The temperature in the room dropped to an unbearable chill, and Lily felt a wave of terror so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. Desperately, she reached for the journal. Her hands shook as she skimmed through the pages, searching for something, anything, that might stop the shadows. There it was, a counter-ritual, one that could break the pact and destroy the shadows once and for all. But it would require great courage and even greater sacrifice. She had no choice. Lily spoke the words from the journal, her voice quivering but steady as she began to chant the incantation. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and twisting in the air, but they fought back, moving toward her faster, more violently. Lily pressed on, her mind focused on the words, on the desperate need to free her father and the town from this curse. But the shadows were relentless. They surrounded her, clawing at her, pulling at her very soul. Her vision blurred, and the line between reality and nightmare seemed to fade. Confronting the shadows. Just as Lily's strength began to falter, the temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows shrieked, their forms growing larger, their power overwhelming. Lily's hands trembled as she struggled to finish the incantation. She could feel the pull of the darkness, and she knew she was running out of time. Suddenly a figure appeared at the door, blocking her escape. Mark, the sheriff. Lily's heart dropped. He stepped into the room, his eyes filled with something dark, something she couldn't quite understand. His face was no longer that of the protector she had once known. You're the leader," Lily whispered, her voice choked with disbelief. Mark's expression was grim. "I've been guiding you, Lily, leading you to this moment. Your father was too weak to complete the ritual, but you're different. You have the strength to finish it." Lily's mind spun. Mark had been helping her, but he wasn't trying to stop the evil. He was trying to ensure the ritual was completed, to uphold the pact. "The town's protection is worth the sacrifice, Lily," Mark said, his voice cold, detached. "Everwood has survived because of the pact. Without it, the darkness will consume us all." The shadows writhed at his words, as if in agreement. Lily's hands clenched into fists. "Number, I won't be part of this. I won't let you continue this cycle of horror." Mark's lips twisted into a smile, but it was no longer friendly. "You don't have a choice." With that, the shadows surged forward, their forms stretching out to envelop her. In that moment, Lily realized what she had to do. She had to make the ultimate choice, complete the ritual and bind herself to the pact, or fight back and risk everything, including her own life. She steeled herself, the last of her resolve hardening into steel. The shadows were closing in. This was her fight. The town's future, her father's legacy, and her own survival were all on the line, and she would not let the darkness win. The final confrontation. Lily's breath was shallow, her pulse thundering in her ears as she faced Mark. The sheriff, the man who had once been a protector, now stood before her as the leader of the very darkness she had fought to expose. His cold eyes bore into hers, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand, Lily," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "Your father was one of us once. He knew what the pact meant. He knew what it took to protect this town. But he grew weak. He wanted to end it. He wanted to expose the truth, but that would have meant the destruction of Everwood. Chaos would have torn this town apart. And you're making the same mistake. Lily shook her head, her voice trembling with anger and fear. You're lying. My father wanted to free this town from the curse. He tried to break the pact, and you... She gestured toward the swirling shadows around them. You're keeping it alive. You're feeding it. Mark took a step forward, his face hardening. You think you can just walk away from this? Your father was a fool to think he could dismantle the protection of Everwood. You'll do the same, and the shadows will consume us all. The pact has kept us safe for generations. Without it, chaos will reign. Lily felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, but something inside her refused to yield. She remembered her father's journal, the cryptic entries, the warnings, and the rituals. He had wanted to expose the cult, to break the cycle, but he had failed. And now, it was her turn. The shadows seemed to respond to Mark's words, swirling faster, their dark tendrils reaching toward them both. The room grew colder, the whispers growing louder in the air. Lily could feel the energy in the room shifting, a sickening pressure building, threatening to consume everything. She looked at Mark, his face now twisted with desperation. You don't have to do this, Mark. There's another way. We can end this curse. We can stop the ritual. Mark's eyes flashed with something darker. You're too naive, Lily. This is bigger than you, than me, than your father. You're too weak to understand what's at stake. As he advanced, the shadows thickened around him, enveloping the room in a suffocating darkness. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't give up now. She had to make a choice. With a final breath, Lily reached for the scrolls her father had left behind. She studied the hidden instructions carefully, the ancient symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. This was her last chance. In one swift motion, she hurled the scrolls into the fire that had been lit on the altar. The flames erupted violently, spreading rapidly, and the shadows shrieked, twisting in agony, as the dark energy began to burn away. The altar cracked, and the air was filled with a deafening roar, the shadows battling against the fire's light. Mark's eyes widened in panic. No! You don't know what you're doing! But it was too late. The altar shattered, the flames consuming everything. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into nothingness, their presence retreating into the ether from which they had come. The temperature in the room skyrocketed, the oppressive weight lifting from the air, leaving only an eerie silence. Lily stood, trembling, her eyes fixed on the broken altar. The shadows were gone, for now at least. As the last remnants of the dark power faded, she could feel Mark's presence behind her, his anger and desperation palpable. But when she turned, he was gone, vanished into the darkness, just as the shadows had been. The room was still, but the weight of what had just transpired hung in the air. The pact had been broken. The town would be safe, for now. Resolution and suspenseful ending. The town of Everwood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the streets, the tension that had made every corner feel dangerous, had lifted. People began to return to their daily lives, some unaware of the terror that had almost consumed them all, others merely relieved that the shadows had vanished. But Lily knew better. She stood at the edge of her father's house, staring out at the town she once called home. her fingers clenched tightly around the journal her father had left behind. The shadows were gone? Yes. But the price of breaking the pact had been high, and there was no telling what would come next. She had freed Everwood from the curse, but she could feel the darkness still lingering just beneath the surface. As she walked away from the house, the familiar streets felt different. The quiet townsfolk now seemed distant, as if their once hidden secrets were just below the surface, waiting to resurface. Lily's heart pounded as she noticed a figure standing on the outskirts of the woods, watching her with an unnerving intensity. The silhouette was dark, its features hidden in the shadow of the trees. She stopped, her pulse quickening. She knew what it meant. The evil had not been destroyed. It had merely been weakened, driven back into the depths for now. And something, or someone, was still watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly began to fade into the forest. She turned, continuing down the road, but before she could take another step, a faint whisper reached her ear. Soft, cold, and ominous. You'll never escape the shadows. Lily froze, her body tense, her heart in her throat. The whisper lingered in the air as she glanced back once more, but there was no one there. Only the dark, silent trees. The town of Everwood may have been free, but the shadows, whatever they were, would never truly be gone. And Lily knew that her battle was far from over.